Well, I'm amazed that I gave the last talk. That's fantastic. I was asking Sue a minute ago, how long ago was it? And I think the only person who probably will know is Alison, because time has been behaving in such an odd way. But then it's very therapeutic, I think, or salutary, actually, not therapeutic, both therapy. We don't need therapy, we need salutary. It's salutary to remember that the people I'm talking about this evening signed up for something without any idea how long it was going to take, just in the same way as we went into our first lockdowns thinking it was only going to be 3 months, and we suddenly find, 2 years down the line and many things are still pretty ghastly. But they had to take 5 or in some cases 6 years out of their lives. So although it's a bit of a cliche to talk about the Second World War in the same way as a pandemic, I do think that having spent the last couple of years in the company of these people who I feel I've sort of probably spent more time with than my own friends and family, I've developed a great respect for them. And actually, although my starting point is, why didn't our fathers and grandfathers and uncles not talk about their experience, I now perfectly understand that they just wanted to get on back to their normal lives again. When I first was invited here, I'd had the happy experience of buzzing around in my attic looking for something else completely different. And I'd found a typewritten cruise, rather short, 18,000 words, not 100 words, about going to the Baltic in 1939 with some photographs and a 21-year-old's diary, a diary very consciously written in 1939. My father was 21 on the 5th of January, 1939, and he could very clearly, he didn't want to see, he wasn't a belligerent young man, he wasn't a confident young man, he didn't want to recognize what was coming, but he knew what was coming towards him and his age group. Therefore, his diary, I think, is written in a sort of conscious way, looking at himself and wondering, seeing himself as a bit of a coward and realizing that he really doesn't want to rush off and join up, realizing eventually that he has to, and discovering this organization called the RNV-SR, which other people had known about, but Dad didn't, because he had such bad eyesight, he didn't think anybody would ever have him. But because of the chaos of Munich, they did. And when you kindly asked me to come here before, I just put together Dad's Cruise of Noromis with his diary reflections during that 1939 year, and some scattered sort of hints and bits that I'd found in the suitcase, photographs, lots of sort of chits marked secret, which slightly bothered me, and letters from naval intelligence, which slightly troubled me. I thought, what is my dad? What's he up to? But anyway, that was the story of Noromis. And once you start to research a really interesting and varied group of people, you can't actually stop. So I suppose, in a way, lockdown and quiet times was a blessing, because it gave me, as I say, the chance to get to know other people, read a lot of, hooray for Amazon Marketplace, hooray for Abe books, hooray for everybody who sells you 1950s books nice and cheap, because in the process, I discovered other books. And I've started, and I hope that I shall continue doing this, republishing some of them, not in a sort of professional way, but under my own imprint as the Yachtsmen volunteers. And I'm happy to be here tonight because the next one in the Yachtsmen volunteers series actually gets published tomorrow. So we're not having any, hoo-ha for it, except I'm going to a lecture on Antarctica, because it's a quite an explorer's book. But thank you for letting me do that tonight. And I put books here, and of course, you know, in a commercial way, if anybody wants to buy them, you know, if you've got a £5 or a £10, I shall happily take it from you. But the job of this evening is to see how family research and family history led me further on. So when I was here before, I talked about my father, George Jones, and the Crews and Romis. I probably didn't talk, I don't think, about my uncle, Jack Jones, who wasn't nearly so keen to join up. I think he may have been in a reserved occupation. He was an engineer, he was an industrial designer in Birmingham. But all the same, he didn't rush for the colours. He just started to get his articles published in Yachting Monthly. The fact that several of the Yachting Monthly staff left gave more of a chance for Jack to write his articles. I had a lovely time researching here with your wonderful collection of Yachting Monthlies. And I was rather shocked to find that my uncle was both writing the anonymous and provocative columns called Canvas, and also answering himself in the letters column in order, you know, to generate a bit of controversy. But he did catch up in the end. And oddly enough, Jack, I did hear, he did talk about the war because he was very angry about it. He was very angry about the Dieppe raid, where he was quite badly wounded. I've got this book here, which when I inherited his books, it has all sorts of scribbles in the margin saying, that shows the uncaring attitude of the Navy in those days. Huh, a Mountbatten whitewash, I see. And he was very angry. And also, because Jack was gay, he was also very angry when I knew him, which was, I was born in the 50s, when there was tremendous, you know, a swing against homosexuality. And he said, you know, the Navy were happy enough to take my body, you know, in the war. And now it's peace, you know, suddenly I feel that I can't, you know, live openly. But anyway, his story ended okay. But it was quite interesting that it was the angry man that I was hearing from. When I started looking into Neuronis, several people, and I think people here may have said so, they said, goodness, it's just like the Riddle of the Sands, isn't it? Because Neuronis, Dad and his companions were on this little motor yacht, sort of poking around in the in Kiel, taking photographs of warships, and then rather being escorted out of German waters rather firmly. I mean, this was, you know, mid-August 1939, so you can see that having a couple of Englishmen, you know, walking up and down the quay, sort of taking pictures of your best warships, you know, was maybe, you know, not the most tactful thing. But so it sent me back to the Riddle of the Sands, and I do think that the Riddle of the Sands is one of those books, the more you read it, the better it gets. And then I started to read more about Erskine Childers himself. And that's a particularly good book, the Maldwyn Drummond book there, because one of the things it shows is how the Riddle of the Sands suddenly sent lots of excitable young men off to do little bits of amateur reconnaissance. Childers was, well, a complex character. I mean, lots of us, you know, like to think that we're complex characters, but I think he took it, you know, further than most. But as I looked at aspects of his career and then looked at the yachtsmen, you know, who are actually my proper subject for research, I could sort of see that in a way he was a progenitor of many things that I hadn't thought about. For instance, he was a volunteer in the Boer War, and that was the war where many people sort of got the idea of dirty fighting, guerrilla fighting, how much damage small groups can do. Now, that was an idea that would come to fruition in the Second World War, and many of the people I was researching would be part of that. He was happy to be controversial. In the middle there, you'll see his wife and Conor O'Brien's cousin, Mary Spring Rice, gun running just before, that's July 1914. But yet in August 1914, he had no hesitation at all, and neither did Conor O'Brien or any of them in joining up to fight on the English, the imperial side. His theme in Riddle of the Sands is how the particular qualities of yachtsmen should be used in time of war. And that's something that I think was borne out again and again. He himself was taken on board that requisitioned cross-channel ferry in order to be a navigator. When they started, they had the Cuxhaven raid. And Childers, as an individualist, didn't have a very happy war, but he certainly had an interesting war. Whereas the RNVR, which had been founded very soon after the Riddle of the Sands, the Riddle of the Sands is also, as well as advocating for the special qualities of yachtsmen, is also saying we must train people to volunteer for the sea. We must have naval volunteers, yachtsmen volunteers, my theme again and again, yachtsmen volunteers for time of war, because war in the future will need to be an amphibious activity. You can't just do it all out, in the open sea. It's not all going to be like Nelson and Trafalgar. So it's going to be creeping in and out of coasts. And that may not have been particularly true of the First World War, although there was some of that sort of thing. But my goodness, wasn't that the situation in the Second World War? So in a funny sort of way, Childers has been a sort of guiding light. And I have chosen all my chapter titles from the Riddle of the Sands. And I swear to you, the more you read that book, the better it is. There's some fabulous writing in it. One thing I'd like to just throw out for you to think about. I was reading a biography of Conor O'Brien, the Irish round the world yachtsman, yacht designer, general misfit, I think. And the writer of this biography just casually said, of course, there's the innate subversiveness of small boat sailing. Now, I'd like to throw that out. Do we feel there is something innately subversive about small boat sailing? I would suggest it's the moment that you chuck your RYA handbook over the side and say, damn it. But that's probably a subversive thing to say. Anyway, in the years between the wars, poor Childers, of course, was executed in 1922. The years between the wars were difficult in all sorts of ways. And one of them, of course, was the effect of the wholesale slaughter of men of a certain age, and a sort of a generation gap opened up. And the young chap on the far side is the older brother of Neville Shute, Norway, who through my researches has actually come to be one of my tremendous heroes. And if any of you haven't recently reread Neville Shute's novels, may I commend that. But Shute is very articulate about how when he was at school during the First World War, he just simply assumed that he was growing up to be killed, and that was what was going to happen. And it was really quite a shock to him when he found that it was 1918, and he was helping people with the flu. He was actually burying people who'd caught Spanish flu on their way back from France, but he was himself still alive. And I think for many people, this came as something of a surprise. And one of the things that Shute did very sensibly was go sailing. And I think that there is a lovely boom in the 1920s of small boat sailors. Before that, you can think of sailing as quite, sorry, Childers, but quite a recherche sport, you know, quite a sort of kings and emperors sport. People who go messing off on, you know, little converted lifeboats like Vixen are quite rare. In the 1920s and 1930s, they become much more common. Here, the second picture is one of my heroes, who I've got to know in my books, a chap called Robin Balfour. I thought I wasn't going to like him because, you know, he became a lord and he was the son of a Sheffield steel magnate and all of that. But when he was a young chap learning his trade, and he wasn't a lord or anything like that, he built himself a 10-foot cruising dinghy. This is a 10-foot cruising dinghy. So anybody who wants to moan that their 36-foot boat is not long enough and they need 45 feet, please stop it, because he had 10 feet. And do you know where he circumnavigated? He circumnavigated Lincolnshire. So, you know, eat your heart out, the globe, you know, there's Lincolnshire waiting for you with a friend. That's two of them, you know, in this 10-foot dinghy. The next person along is Ludovic Kennedy's father, Captain Edward Kennedy. And Ludovic said he found his father absolutely impossible to speak to. He loved him very much, impossible to speak to about anything, because he was one of the naval officers who'd been made redundant in the interwar years. And there's this massive cost cutting, this massive getting rid of people, getting rid of boats, failing to learn the lessons of the previous war. That seems to be, you know, standard sort of government practice. But he did love him very much. Some of the young men of the time, the richer ones, who didn't have to work until 12 o'clock every Saturday and be back in the office on Monday morning, sort of needed to prove themselves. And there's quite an interesting group who crop up again in my Yachtsmen, and that's tomorrow's book, From Pole to Pole, The Life of Quentin Riley. They did some very sort of extraordinary polar, Arctic and Antarctic explorations. Augustine Courtauld was another of them. And you can sort of see that in a way their fathers, their older brothers have been to the war. They haven't. They need to do something. So some go sailing, some go to high latitudes. When it came into the 1930s, and it became, I'm afraid, more obvious that the balance of power, the naval agreements saying, you know, you can only have so many submarines because we've got so many submarines, that sort of thing, was all falling to pieces. And there was the Abyssinian crisis, and suddenly the Admiralty realized they'd got to get on and build more ships. They knew that there was going to be quite a serious problem to find the officers for those ships. They probably thought to themselves in a I don't know, a complacent sort of way or a uncaring sort of way, that you can get the men to fill the ships, you know, if you absolutely have to. You can always, you know, send out a press gang or, you know, have conscription or something like that. But to get officers who actually understand a little bit about ship handling and the way the sea works wasn't going to be so easy, because of course they retired or sacked them all in the Geddes Act in the 1920s. They did have the regular RNVR, but that was capped at a certain limit, and you sort of had to pay them. You had to give them uniform and expenses and things like that. So they didn't want to do that. So that was the point of the RNV SR, that you asked yachtsmen to put their names forward, you know, to serve in case of an emergency. You didn't have to give them any uniforms, you didn't have to give them any training, you didn't really have to do anything much, but you had this wonderful list of 2,000 names of yachtsmen from late 1936 onwards, and those are the people that I've been focusing on. And naturally, there's always, you know, commercial interests leap into the breach, and Captain O.M. Watts Limited very soon started to say, well, actually, if you want to be any use, you know, when you get called up in case of an emergency, come and study one of our Board of Trade Yachtmaster certificates, and they sort of, did it so it would work for yachtsmen. Some people did what had confused me so much with my little Neuromis thing. They went off and did bits of reconnaissance. Phil very kindly mentioned to me when we were here before that his father, Michael Spender, went with Augustine Courtauld and Molly to Norway to sort of poke about and see what was what. And I did, as you suggested, I read Molly's book about how the men were sort of pacing out the piers, the length of the piers, trying to look all sort of nonchalant, and she had to pretend to look the other way. But in fact, it was perfectly obvious what they were doing. That chap there, Jerry Holdsworth, he was another person. He was a yachtsman. He'd signed up for the RNV SR. He had a lovely pilot cutter, and he too went out looking for things. Some of these people eventually will find their way into the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, which does sort of suggest there's something in that idea about, subversiveness and independent-mindedness. And I think it's certainly a theme that I was discovering as I was getting to know these people better. That's a very funny, I think it's a very funny picture of Augustine Courtauld, of Man the Ropes, who's a very straightforward chap, actually. And I think I've got to know his son, Julian, a little bit. And Julian has sadly died just after that book came out. But I sort of said to him with slight tentatively, do you think if your dad was alive today, we'd probably put him on a spectrum somewhere? And he said, yes, I think we probably would. Because the lovely thing about Augustine Courtauld, he's just straightforward. He's a very rich man. He does what he likes. He never thinks badly of people. And so to see him, he was recruited into something called Section D, where he had to sort of this was in sort of 1938, 1939, the sort of amateur surreptitious subterfuge, and it just didn't suit him at all. And there's a very funny bit in his wife's book when she said that Major Lawrence Grand of Section D, who are these forerunners of the Special Operations Executive, came to stay, and he left his revolver under the pillow and upset the housemaid. I mean, isn't that awful? But so they could see war coming. Different people had different bright ideas. Some people went off, time spent on reconnaissance is seldom wasted. Sadly, it appears to be almost totally wasted because the Admiralty appears to have done absolutely nothing with these pacings up and down piers. But anyway, finally, it sounds like it's a good thing. It's not. Marjorie Allen described it as the bit in a film where something is falling and you think, is it going to, and it does. And then there we are in September 1939, and Chamberlain has run out of ways to put off the evil hour. It is interesting, I think, recently how we have had to reappraise Chamberlain and Munich a little bit, because it does seem very clear that the armed forces were saying to him in 1938, absolutely don't do it. We don't have any planes. We've got virtually no ships. Can you please hold off Herr Hitler for a bit longer? And I think, in some ways, Chamberlain may have been a bit of a fall guy. There's an interesting bit in my father's diary when he's in Birmingham, because that's where he was working at the time. And Chamberlain comes to make a speech when he's feeling really fed up and let down by Hitler, breaking his promises yet again. And Dad says Chamberlain makes a fighting speech. And it's at that point, actually, that Dad decides, I'm really going to have to go and find something to sign up for and join. But it was difficult. of course it was difficult, it's a stupid thing to say, it was terribly sad for many people. And if you read the yachting magazines, particularly Yachting World, which was so much a racing magazine, but also Yachting Monthly, it'd been a fast net year. So, the magazines have been full of the German Navy coming over with Nordwind, that tremendous, huge, very fast yacht, which took line honours through the fast net. And they said, but these are our friends. These are people we've been sailing against, racing against. When Dad's moored in Copenhagen, there's a German yachtsman next to him, and it's the 24th of August, and Hitler and Stalin have just made their nasty pact, and he said, I'm sorry, I've got to go. I'm so sorry it's come to this. And there is, certainly in 1939, there is a very deep regret among many yachting people. The beautiful yacht in the middle there is Latifa, who actually came fourth in the fast net that year, and she'd been notable for having a tremendous sort of match within a match against Nordwind. And one of the crew on Latifa was a chap called the Honourable Ewan Montague. He had his own beautiful yacht, which he then won the La Rochelle race with. And he was very fiercely Jewish. And you can't help wondering whether the general bonhomie between the British yachtsman and the German yachtsman was already getting a little bit soured. Certainly the Nordwind thing seemed to rankle for quite a long time. There was a great feeling of we must carry on. And so that's the Yachting Monthly proprietor actually stepped forward and said, don't worry, we will carry on. Interestingly, not really to help people who'd got yachts, be nice for fitting out and cruising. But he said he was aware how many people read the magazines who don't have yachts, but who dream of going sailing, and for whom the magazine, is a dream. And he said he felt that would be more important in the forthcoming conflict than the specifics of yacht maintenance and management and all of that. I think that's very true, and it certainly Yachting Monthly through the war soon turned itself also into the RNVR journal, and you can see it's actually doing a very useful sort of morale building job, sort of just reminding people this is actually what you're fighting for. You're fighting for the chance to get back and go sailing again, or you're fighting for the chance to have a peaceful and beautiful world. I was very pleased recently to find that very bizarre looking brigantine there, which was a home-built yacht by a young man who'd lost his father in the Battle of the Somme in the First World War, very marked by that experience. And he was obviously, he was, I think, 3 at the time, and grew up with his mother and very little money. And they sort of managed to build and live on this extraordinary looking vessel, sorry, but she is. And he'd been up reconnoitering North Norway. He'd been as far as Petsamo. He'd actually been as far as Finland. And he was certain that the Admiralty were going to really want to know the things that he'd been discovering. But I'm sorry to say that when he came back, saying, look, I've got all this charts, I've got all this information, I said, go away, don't bother us, we've got a war to run. When it came to September 1939, people's fortunes varied. People who were just sort of like gophers, like my dad, because he was in the paymaster branch, so they actually needed him to go and bean count. He should have repaired to his ship on the 25th of August. Unfortunately, he wasn't there, so he didn't. So he was very quickly, immediately sent off. People like that chap in the middle, Dennis Rayner, who was a yachtsman. Does anybody know Robinetta? Delightful little. No, you don't know Robinetta? Yes, good. Right. Dennis designed and built Robinetta in 1936. Oh, you mean the cables?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, right. Good. Well, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's lovely to think that isn't it great how so many of our boats are going to outlive all of us? After this, so Dennis Rayner was the sort of chap who hadn't got into the Navy, wasn't really interested in his normal job. His heart and soul had been poured into the regular RNVR. So he'd done all the training courses, he'd passed the exams. He was straight off to war. And where he was sent first was to Lowestoft, to this public park where there was a Pierrot show going on, to take it over to be the centre for the Royal Naval Patrol Service. And one of the sort of extraordinary things that I think I rather I do like in wartime, is how suddenly all sorts of things were requisitions. It's tough if you happen to be, the person whose house has been taken, but whatever. Or yachts, lots and lots of yachts requisitioned. But it's how to turn, there's a nice pleasure garden that will have, as I say, there were two sisters, and they were called Dulcie and somebody, and they were Jack Hawkins' sister, and they were, they were going to, shake their legs in the air and give a song and dance thing, and Rayner had to say, "No, sorry, this is now HMS Europa. This is the headquarters of the Royal Naval Patrol Service." And up in the top there, that's newly built Pride of Hove. That's their newly built swimming pool and leisure complex. Well, that became HMS King Alfred, where these RNV SR people were going to be turned into proper RNVR officers, because they were going to have to jolly well get along there and learn the King's regulations, because that was the most important thing. I mean, yes, they were going to learn to march and fire guns and things, but King's regulations and Admiralty instructions, when I read Dad's commission, it's all about how you're going to obey King's regulations and Admiralty instructions, and how other people are going to obey King's regulations and Admiralty instructions. And that's the thing. The Navy had, in Childer's time, was very anxious about having these volunteers, because they said, what if they don't obey naval discipline? So once the volunteers promise to obey naval discipline, it's just about okay. But it was still quite a sort of shaky beginning, as how to incorporate these KCs, these journalists, these gentlemen with no occupation because they were just gentlemen, these aristocratic yachtsmen who'd suddenly turned up, ready for action. The Navy was very uncertain to start with. What was he going to do with these chaps? Because they were amateurs. They weren't, the proper professional thing. Whereas people like Dennis Rayner, they could sort of see where he fitted in the scheme of things. But what they mainly did was send people off minesweeping and patrolling, because absolutely, in some ways, the Admiralty wasn't ready. In some ways, it was very ready. And as soon as war was declared, they were out laying mines to have a defensive barricade all the way up the East Coast. And so the minute you've got a defensive barricade, then your East Coast convoys bringing your coal up and down, from Scotland and Newcastle down to London, have got to be kept safe. They did remember that from the First World War. Then, of course, you need minesweepers to make sure that the channels in between the minefields are kept clear. And that is the job that started on day one and went on right the way through the war, often forgotten, not romantic, dangerous, cold, dull, terrifying. And it's quite, so the HMS Kellet in the middle there. She's a First World War minesweeper, and by the end of the Second World War, they really said they just couldn't be dealing with her anymore, because you don't see it in the picture there, but great gouts of black smoke were sort of belching out the whole time. But the person sent to be her third officer was this chap down in the corner, who was Lord Stanley of Alderley. And he had 3 different titles, so he'd applied to each of the different services under using one of his different. He was the Earl of this and the anyway. But his heart was in sailing, and he did actually write a very nice little book of cruising reminiscences, which I'm sure is in your library, called Sea Peace. And there's a moment in it when he says on September the 4th. And he'd been at that point, he'd been assigned to do some training on a destroyer, and he saw his paid hand, Mr. Parsons, taking his boat to Brixham, where she was going to be laid up for the duration. And he said, at that moment, a curtain came down over my mind. And he's very effective, oddly enough, at conveying the emotional sort of blank out. This is a war, I've got to deal with it. My normal life is absolutely on hold. But he was a shocking playboy. He'd gambled away his family estates. He'd sort of abandoned his wife and child. You know, he was shocking in every way. But there he is doing his duty on a First World War minesweeper, and you know, just sticking with it. And this, I think, is one of the rather admirable things. To start with, I thought, oh my God, there's going to be too many aristocrats and old Etonians in my book. But actually, fortunately, they're not. They just tend to be a bit more obvious. But what is really, you know, very impressive is how these really dull, tough jobs, you know, people just went off, you know, being a sort of sent on a harbour defence yacht, and your only job is to sort of go out and see other ships through the boom that's has to be opened when the destroyer comes in. You have to go out, get the boom opened, let the destroyer in. You know, and the people who had put their names forward doing this, you know, had been very often, you know, either just out of university or young barristers, heck of a lot of lawyers in here, or people having their sort of, you know, their lively young manhood, and yet there they are. And it was a filthy winter, the winter of 1939, 40. So it was very, if one felt like grumbling over loss, it was very salutary to remember just why one shouldn't actually be grumbling. One of the things that the Admiralty remembered from the First World War is how effective it had been in the First World War to try and starve Germany. We have an awful lot of moaning about how Germany tried to starve us. Actually, in the First World War, we were shockingly effective at starving Germany by blockading up, you know, sort of beyond the Faroes. There's those sort of northern ways of sort of getting round to Germany, blockading German ports, and very sort of immediately. I mean, some people didn't even get their chance to go to King Alfred if they were in the RNV SR, like this poor chap here, Lieutenant Geoffrey Darlow, who'd done his, because one of the things that the people who were trying to persuade you to do the coastal certificate was, well, you'll get called up more quickly if you've already got your certificate. And so he'd gone on and he got his, and so he never went to King Alfred. He was straight off to that converted big sort of, you know, Greenland trawler. They converted them into anti-submarine warfare trawlers, really, you know, tough, sturdy things. And you know, he was away, you know, up towards Iceland, because we didn't want the Germans getting round into the Atlantic. Of course, you know, some of them had already gone. So it was slightly an abortive exercise, a very tough exercise. The idea was you had to stop people and say, excuse me, I'd like to know what you're carrying. could you please go into Kirkwall in the Orkneys and, show your cargo? If you thought it was a neutral or a oddly flagged ship, if it was a German ship, you just, tried to tackle them, turn them back, or if they wouldn't, you said, please abandon your ship because we're going to sink it. But unfortunately, this make do amend approach, which is all very well if you're turning a municipal swimming pool into a place to train officers, doesn't work so well if you've got an old P&O liner like the Royal Pindy, commanded by Captain Kennedy, Ludovic Kennedy's father, and you send her out, you give her a couple of guns, and you give her a lovely, a retired naval captain, and you tell her crew, sorry, either you leave or you sign up on the Navy dotted line. And there she is, patrolling away, and she meets, serious German warships. She meets the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, and within 20 minutes, she's because Captain Kennedy, being a naval man, is in the spirit of Nelson, and it's no surrender if you're a naval man. Whereas if you are a merchantman, you could decently say, oh, okay, fine, let us get clear. We'll we accept that you're bigger than us. But and that was one of those weird things that everybody says, God, isn't it great? Isn't that the great traditions of the British Navy? Well, actually, it meant that several hundred people got killed and nothing was gained. Sort of extraordinary sort of emotional national thing. Quietly, a month, just 3 weeks before that, Northern Rover had just disappeared, and it was discovered later, of course, that she'd been torpedoed, but nobody said. And so when the Yachting Monthly finally starts their Roll of Honour, Geoffrey Darlow is the first name on the Roll of Honour, and it just says, well, the ship hasn't been heard of again. This is now several months later, and you think about the anxiety for the families and people. So there we are back in Lowestoft, and after the war there's that very, very splendid, rather sort of over the top, it sort of looks as if it should be at the Menin Gate or somewhere, but there it is with panels showing all the men, not all men, but the people of the Royal Naval Patrol Service who died. And the first on the list is poor Sub-Lieutenant Geoffrey Darlow, who joined the RNV SR, took his exams, went off, joined Northern Rover, and that was the end of that. Another very difficult time, the winter of 1939, 1940, on land, people say, well, there's not much war going on here. Well, that just wasn't true at sea. At sea, there was a lot of war going on, not the sort where you have fleets of battleships that fight each other, but mine laying and patrolling in little skirmishes. And suddenly there's a most inexplicable spate of sinkings up the entrance of Kent and Essex and Suffolk-Norfolk coast, the sort of entrance to the Thames estuary. And ships are going down all over the place. And it comes a point that HMS Gypsy just goes down in Harwich Harbour, and Churchill is furious. He says, what? And he sacks the commander of Harwich Harbour, and everybody's in a frightful state. And one of the people who they suddenly dig out is this chap in the top here. Obviously, he's quite a bit older then, but he is yet another of these Jewish lawyers who really comes in to the fight, with absolute determination. He's been active in. He's in Hitler's Black Book anyway. He's been active in politics, And he's very entertaining the way he describes. I went to Captain Watts and I studied for my coastal certificate. I realized this is not how a real mariner should do it, but it was the best I could do while I was building up my legal practice. Anyway, somehow he gets picked out, and they say, actually, he said, I did everything because I want to go to sea and serve the British Navy. They said, actually, sorry, you're never going to sea. You're not going to serve the British Navy. You're going to come put your lovely legal brain into working out what are the common factors among all these sinkings. And so he becomes a sort of investigator throughout the war. Fascinating. Little tendency to exaggerate, but when you check his figures, but his facts are there. At the same time, there's a lot of vicar's sons I've noticed in my book as well. Here's a vicar's son from Canada, very impecunious, very clever, sailing in Canada, joined the Canadian RNVR, came over here to go to take an academic post in London, and so joined RNVR as well. And again, the Navy suddenly starts to be quite clever at spotting people who, not for the sort of jobs that they thought they were coming to do, you know, like go and serve on a destroyer or something, but for actually their intellectual abilities. And that's Charles Goodeve. And he's the person who actually works out about magnetic mines and about how you degauss ships by making their magnetism go the other way round. I tell you, I've been meeting some extraordinarily interesting people in my quiet years at home. Anyway, so that was the sort of muddle and the a lot of death at sea, and a lot of things needing to be covered up as well, because nobody wanted to know just how fast these ships were going down. And then there was the war in Finland, and there's Churchill, who isn't Prime Minister at this point. He's First Lord of the Admiralty, and he's longing to go off and lay mines down the Norwegian coast, and he's longing to go and help the Finns. But everybody says, no, First Lord, let's just think more carefully about these things. So they don't actually do anything. But meanwhile, my man Quentin Riley, the polar explorer, who's mouldering about on one of these harbour defence yachts and is quite actually bored, says there's a chance there's going to be a skiing battalion equipped. So he sort of leaves the RNVR without exactly asking permission and goes off with his friend Andrew Croft, who's in the army, and they have a wonderful time saying, well, if you're going up to the Arctic, what you need is proper sealskin, reversible coats, and they have a lovely time because they've had, and that's Quentin Riley in his little boat towing a plane on one of their expeditions. They have actually had proper experience, but again, they don't quite get listened to in any way. Then the war with Finland doesn't happen. Meanwhile, here's my man, Patrick Dalzell-Job, who had that extraordinary brigantine, the Mary Fortune. And he's come back, and he too, he's been put on one of those sort of, well, they're not non-jobs because somebody's got to do them, but the jobs where you're on a yacht waiting to open the boom gate, for the destroyer to come in. But again, suddenly the Navy wakes up, think, hang on, we've got this chap. Didn't we have a chap who could speak Norwegian? And they pop him on board HMS Southampton when finally, we're going to go and do something in Norway. But unfortunately, by then Hitler's already gone and invaded Norway. Anyway, I won't get into that. And Patrick Dalzell-Job is sort of saying, well, do you not realise there's going to be snow in Norway in April? He said, snow in April? I don't think so. And of course they arrived as HMS Southampton. Yes, there is snow in April, and they haven't got any winter camouflage. And his book is absolutely excellent, but he's so I'm sorry, so stroppy. And I think, again, it is the innate subversiveness of small boat sailors, because, you know, when he's told that no, he hasn't got time to go and rescue a load of civilians in an old folks' home in Namsos, he just goes and does it anyway. You know, he expects to be chucked out, but he says he's not really that bothered about it. It's not a happy time for him in Norway. Meanwhile, Croft and Riley have also gone to Norway, and they've joined up with a chap called Colin Gubbins, who you probably have heard of because he's quite famous as the founder of the Special Operations Executive. And they have these irregular companies, and you see Croft and Riley sort of landing people up fields in little Norwegian puffers, setting fire to ammunition dumps, doing all sorts of things. And you realise that sort of in later life, if you'd met them in later life, you'd have thought, God, they're boring, because Croft became chief superintendent at Hendon, the police college, and Riley was a member of the Church of England Synod. You know, and you think, what an extraordinary past life they've had. So Norway was a terrible wake-up call. Obviously, that was the moment at which Chamberlain was forced to resign. Churchill left the Admiralty and became Prime Minister. So it was a major shake-up, but unfortunately, it was a shake-up too late, because very soon afterwards, we're into May, and you've got the Blitzkrieg, you've got Holland and Belgium and France invaded. And I found myself very, perhaps just because, you know, like I've been quite recently to Calais, and the story of the Churchill's refusal to allow Calais to be evacuated, to buy time for Dunkirk. You think, God, the harsh decisions that have to be made. When he told Brigadier Nicholson, who was in charge, I'm sorry, there's not going to be an evacuation. And apparently he wrote in his diary he felt sick afterwards, because, you know, he knew what that meant. So Admiral Ramsay over at Dover had got lots of, you know, vessels ready to evacuate Calais, but they weren't allowed to. But there was just one moment in which that very posh yacht, sort of, you know, certainly I'd love to see today's, you know how bizarre today's super yachts are. Well, those are the super yachts. She was owned by a Greek gambling syndicate, you know, and Wallace Simpson and the Prince of Wales had been guests on board. Well, so she was painted all over with red crosses to signify she was a hospital ship, and whizzed in to Calais at the last moment, got shot at immediately, but just had a chance to rescue, I think there were 47 people on the mole, before rushing back to Dover. And among the people she rescued was this artist, George Lampson, who painted this extraordinary, I'd love to go, it's in the Imperial War Museum, I'd love to go and see it. It's called Died of Wounds, Calais, and sort of sums up the sort of, you know, the horribleness of it. In the middle there, not all, but most of our RNV SR men would love to have been serving on destroyers. Destroyers were the sort of go-to vessel, and usually only the ones with connections got themselves accepted at this stage on a destroyer. Poor Peter Scott, who also became one of my sort of, you know, friends, who's always writing off to, you know, see if he could be on a destroyer, and he was always promised and it didn't quite happen. But anyway, this chap, Sir Marmaduke Blenner Hassett, who was a racing driver and a member of the RNV SR, he was on the destroyer HMS Greyhound, which was a tremendously hard-working destroyer and had just come hurtling back from Norway, and she and HMS Grafton were told to bombard the German positions outside Calais to try and give the people in Calais a little bit of respite. And a sort of a fluke shell came through and killed him and wounded 2 others. And by this time, the Yachting Monthly has started to run its RNVR section as a, it's a roll of honor, it's a tribute to people, but it's also starting to have little snippets of sort of heartwarming information. Later on, they start doing engagements, births, marriages, anything to try and balance the increasing roll of deaths that they're having to print. And so on the very same day as he was killed at Calais, his wife had a baby who was the next Sir Marmaduke Blennerhassett. So just one of those stupid little details that mean nothing but sort of seem to say something when you're in the middle of a war. Now I can see that we're coming up to the magic hour of 8, but I think that I'm just going to talk about Dunkirk, not very much, because I think, if there's one subject we all feel we've read quite a lot of, and there's always more to read about Dunkirk. But one of the, on my topic of RNVSR Yachtsmen and what might be some of the special qualities, is Childers right? Are there some special qualities that that Yachtsmen can bring to fighting? This man, Robert Hitchens, tremendously famous, but mainly famous for his work in coastal forces. But at the time of Dunkirk, he was on this minesweeper, HMS Niger, and he'd been, sweeping mines. Anyway, they were sent off down to Dunkirk to take part in the evacuation. And he was horrified. He just said, these people have no idea how you get people on and off ashore. And I thought to myself, yeah, he's absolutely right. That is one thing that people, who go sort of coastal cruising do have a few ideas about. It's how you do or don't launch, a boat in surf. And he suddenly finds, and he writes a diary, and his son Anthony has done a very excellent biography. And he said, suddenly I realized that the skills I developed through hopping in and out of small boats since I was 6 years old, this was the day that they were going to be useful. And so, because the soldiers are not, they're anchored quite a way off the surf. The soldiers aren't wanting to get into the whalers. The ship's boats are overturning. It's an absolute hash up. And so Hitchens just, goes ashore and, gets some ropes to help people balance themselves. He does practical things just because of the confidence he feels in his ability to get in and out of small boats on beaches. There comes a moment when he's promised the soldiers he'll be back. HMS Niger says, no, sorry, we've been ordered back to Dover. And he says, well, I'm sorry, but I promised to stay here. And again, that's the sort of attitude that I find that I come across quite frequently. It's not that people weren't, obeying naval discipline and doing all that, but quite often he was a solicitor. He was a bit older. He was in his 40s. Late 30s actually. He sort of knew his own mind, and he had the confidence to say, look, if you don't mind, if you don't need me to get back to Dover, I've promised the soldiers I'm staying here. And I do think that he is one of my patterns for. I don't think I'd have liked him if I met him, but for what it means about these qualities of common sense, tenacity, sizing up a situation and thinking what's best to be done, rather than waiting for somebody else to give you an order. He was horrified when he got there. He said, "Where are the beach masters? You know, who's organising this?" And the answer was, at his patch of beach, nobody. So anyway, the thing I took from the Dunkirk evacuations were quite often people realising, this is where I get to use my own initiative. So I think that I'm dead on the 8 o'clock. So I think we will pause there and carry on at 20 past. At 20 past. Lovely. Thank you.
I'm really enjoying it, Julia. It's fabulous. So, ladies and gentlemen at the back, if you can be quiet, and if you're at home, you can make as much noise as you like. Welcome back, Julia. Away you go.
I think it was a good place to pause at the fall of France and at Dunkirk, and at that particularly dire moment in our national story, if you like, because I think May, June, probably April, May, June 1940 was a moment when lots of people reconsidered their positions. So there were people, for instance, who hadn't rushed to join the RNV SR, probably because there were age ranges, probably because they were doing other things, you know, people had reasons. But in April, May 1940, particularly April, the Admiralty started to put out advertisements, not just in the Yachting Monthly, but also in newspapers like the Times. So, for instance, Nicholas Montserrat, who was a socialist and a pacifist, so therefore had been working as an ambulance driver in London, but there hadn't, because it'd been that very odd, quiet winter, there hadn't been any ambulances to drive, there hadn't been any stretchers to bear. His father sent him an advertisement from the Times, you know, for gentlemen interested in yachting. And he suddenly thought, oh, blow it, you know, I'm going to stop being a pacifist. I'm going to stop being a socialist. I'm going to join the RNVR. So he did. If you look in the Yachting Monthly, you'll see all sorts of advertisements for what they call elderly yachtsmen. I don't want to upset anybody here, but elderly yachtsman usually means you're about 40. So sorry about that. But so people like Neville Shute, for instance, he'd served at the very end of the First World War and not had to do anything, with great relief. Then he'd had an extraordinarily interesting career building up a little aviation business and doing, you know, all sorts of interesting stuff. But he was clearly a difficult so-and-so. So by 1938, or 37, I think, his company had sort of bought him out. And so he'd gone to be a full-time novelist, and he'd written several novels, and this always makes me smile. And it shouldn't be part of the talk, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Ruined City, that wonderful Depression novel by Shute, had an offer for the film rights. So on the strength of the offer for the film rights, he'd commissioned from Hilliard this lovely sort of 40-foot new build yacht called Runagate. Before that, he'd got a slightly cranky Estonian smack yacht, which he sailed. He was a very keen amateur weekend sailor. And of course, in the way of film rights, actually nothing ever happened. And I have to laugh about this because the only reason my lovely husband, was my partner then, said that we could have Peter Duck was he thought he'd had an offer for the film rights of his Karl Marx book. And I would love to have a little subsection of research of how many reckless purchases have been made when you think somebody's going to buy some film rights. But anyway, that was Neville Shute's story. And so he was really quite set on being a full-time writer, and so he didn't rush off to join the colours at the very beginning. of the war. He was writing the most, I think, I don't know about you, but I've in the past tended to read, you know, a Neville Shute here and a Neville Shute there, and never really put them in any sort of order. Well, so during this recent period, I read the ones in 1938, 1939, and 40 in order, and they're really interesting. And if nobody else has done this, may I commend it to you? You start with whatever happened to the Corbetts, and you suddenly, and that's a 1938 novel, and it suddenly makes you aware of the terror that people felt about gas and about obliterating bombing from the air because they'd seen Guernica. And they thought that that was what was going to happen. You know, people really believed that the first thing that would happen at the beginning of the Second World War, probably war wouldn't even be announced, suddenly there would be obliterating bombing. And Shute writes a story, and I won't tell you, but I will tell you that they do go and seek safety on their smack yacht. So that's a good thing to do. But then he moves on with Landfall, with Pied Piper, and they really do make, if you look at them in the chronology, you think when he's writing them and what's happening in the world when he's writing them, they're really a very, I think, maybe I'm just ignorant, an under recognized resource for understanding how people felt in World War II. Ewan Montague, who you last met in the Fastnet on Latifa, he was a member of the RNVSR because he too had served just at the very end of the First World War, and he just said that he was just never going anywhere near any mud ever again. Therefore, it was going to have to be the Navy for him. And he got sent off to one of those patrol yachts, rather a glamorous one. I think it belonged to Cornelius Vanderbilt or somebody like that. And suddenly the Navy woke up to the fact that and they said, you're not going to have a yachting holiday at the government expense. And so they again thought that he was a KC with, you know, a keen brain, and they put him ashore to start gathering intelligence. And he was very fed up about it. And he always refused to be reallocated to the special branch of naval intelligence. He said, no, I'm going to keep my seagoing status just in case I ever get a chance to get sent to sea. And he never did. He worked the whole of the war in ghastly places like the Citadel underneath the Admiralty. But fascinating, and I do commend his Beyond Top Secret You, because he was running double agents. I'm sure you know about all that, but so there's an example of somebody who joined up and again didn't get what he wanted. Neville Shute finally said, oh, okay, I'm going to join. And he asks his wife to take their daughters and go to Canada so that he can really concentrate on being a really, you know, keen naval officer. And once again, the Admiralty take a look and said, hang on, didn't you used to work in aviation? I think we'll have, and so they sent him to go and work for Charles Goodeve, who you met in the anti-magnetic mines campaign. And Shute is furious. He's quite stroppy. The unit that he joins, which is run by Charles Goodeve, is called the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, and it's called the Wheezers and Dodgers. And they're a very eclectic, very left field thinkers, but even among them there's a thing called doing a Norway, which is apparently completely refusing to obey your superior officers' orders. So that's called doing a Norway. But he had to, you know, he had to go and work for Goodeve, and I'm sort of jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the things that I found fascinating about Shute is, well, partly in the book, I didn't know whether to call him Shute or Norway half the time, because when he's a novelist, he's Neville Shute, but when he's working for the Wheezers and Dodgers, he's Neville Norway. And there's a moment, we'll get to it later, when he writes most secret, which I think of all the novels, that's sort of the one. And he says these modern weapons, they are disgusting. They're wicked. They should be outlawed. His narrator goes off to read the Geneva Convention, hoping that somebody's going to say you absolutely cannot spray people with toxic, poisonous, burning oil. But unfortunately, it's not in the Geneva, so they go ahead and spray people with toxic, poisonous, burning oil. And so one half of him, he's doing that for his daily bread. The other half of him, in the evenings, he's a novelist, feeling horrified by what's going on. I think that's deeply interesting, actually. But anyway, that's slightly a diversion. Another person who I got to know, and I would love to discover. I find it very hard to find out any more about him. He's a judge called Edward Terrell, and I met him when I was writing about Marjorie Allingham, because he used to come play cricket at Tolshant Darcy, and they all laughed at him because they thought he was so pompous because he was a judge. But he's also a bit of a weekend sailor, but he doesn't think he's very good at it because he keeps running aground. So he doesn't sign up for the RNVR because he doesn't think his navigation is up for it, but he longs to be in the Navy. So he writes to the Navy and says, I think I am a lawyer. I think I could be useful to you running personnel services, for your officers who are away at sea. If they got a little bit of bother at home, I could help. And again, the Admiralty, shows surprising acumen and says, well, yes, that's very interesting. Perhaps you'd like to go and talk to, our Mr. Goodeve, down the road there, because I think you're probably going to need somebody who can write a decent, specification. So Terrell, at the same time, sort of mentions that he didn't exactly invent exploding fountain pens, but, that sort of, he liked a little bit of amateur chemistry. And he goes to work for the Wheezers and Dodgers and invents the most astonishing things. He works with a tree expert who's also joined the RNVR through the Elderly Yachtsmen scheme. And they develop this sort of resin, which you can put onto merchant shipping mainly, or landing craft, to protect them from the impact of blast, because merchant ships and things don't have armor plating and things like warships. And it's an astounding invention. And of course, the stuffies in the we won't have that sort of thing, no. I think we'll have to send that through the proper channel. So where Neville Norway would have, just thrown wobbly, Terrell is much more subtle, and he's very good at sort of saying, well, tell you what, we won't call it plastic armor, we'll call it plastic protective cladding or something like that. He sort of wheedles his way around. And at the end of the war, when they say, well, thank you very much, Mr. Terrell, he says, excuse me, I point out, I did actually lodge a patent for that. And he takes the Admiralty to court, and B, he then, if you look him up, you'll see he becomes, you read Terrell on patents if you're a lawyer. Anyway, but it was, jolly useful, saved lots of lives. Now this is a astonishing one. Some of the people who joined the RNVSR and later the RNVR, but the RNVSR, were a little bit old. They might have been 40 or something, sort of. Even that chap there was even 44, I think. So clearly unfitted for anything. So when Charles Goodeve had degaused enough ships that the magnetic mines out at sea weren't being as effective as they had been, they started to stockpile back in the Reich. And Goebbels had this good idea that if they were, very handy, at sea, but they were stockpiling a bit, why not, now that we're softening up for the invasion of England, why not stop dropping them on land? So these hideous great things, got dropped on the London docks. A lot of them got dropped in Essex. But because they were originally sea mines, it was the Navy, the Navy's job to do something about them. And of course, they hadn't got, the trained people to do sort of land-based bomb disposal work. So that little chap, John Miller, he was the assistant chief education officer for Northamptonshire before he joined the RNV SR. And he didn't really want to shoot at anybody. So when they said, well, would you like special duties? He said, I'll do special duties. And special duties, turned out you had a fortnight's training, and then you were sent off to defuse these things. And the bravery is just absolutely sort of startling. This chap here, Ash Lincoln is very, because Ash Lincoln, if you remember, was a very observant, very strongly identified Jew, whereas this chap, Harold Newgas, had a nice boat at Falmouth, and he dressed in check clothes, and he was the treasurer of the local Conservative Association, and he was what Lincoln calls an assimilated Jew. But he'd been born in 1896. He was one of the first to join up the Supplementary Reserve, but obviously he was thought of as too old to go to sea or do anything useful. So he said, fine, I'll volunteer for rendering mines safe. And one of his extraordinary jobs he had to do, one of these dirty great magnetic mines had fallen. They had parachutes, you see, so they got caught on things. It had fallen into a gasometer in Liverpool, and it was dangling on this parachute. And just to make matters worse, the gasometer was actually quite near a munitions factory. So the minute this thing went off, there was just a boom it was going to be. So Harold Newgas had to be dressed in a sort of diver's suit with oxygen and lowered into this gasometer, dangling there to defuse this mine. And because he was clearly quite stressed, he got through the oxygen, so he kept having to be hauled out, given more oxygen, let down again. And I think it was something like 6 hours defusing, but it was most astonishing exploit. At the very beginning of all this, when the first of these mines was found at Shoebury-Ness, there was a regular Royal Naval specialist who went down to defuse it. This completely unknown technology, terrifying. And he was given the DSO or something like that. And people said, well, he should have had the Victoria Cross. And there was one of these, sort of nerdish arguments. Well, the Victoria Cross has to be won in the face of the enemy. And, a dirty great mine is not the face of the enemy. But, so the King instituted the George Cross, which is that thing over the far side, which is a very, very, it's second to the VC. It's a very, very admirable one, because civilians and all sorts of people, you have to be outstanding, to get it. And there's also the George Medal. But there was about, within the first 3 months or so, there were about 12 George Crosses given to RNVR and RNVSR members for these astounding acts of bravery. I can't really connect that to their happy times doing weekend sailing, but I'm just chucking it out as a fact. Maurice Griffiths, who'd obviously had to, he was one of the first to go from the Yachting Monthly. He found himself at HMS Vernon, which is the torpedo specialist. He had a very, very sort of odd and interesting walk, because sometimes he too had to drive a van down to the London docks to defuse one of these. He won a George Medal for his work in the London docks, but then part of the other time he was sent off using his sort of yacht surveyor abilities to find grotty old wooden drifters that could then be used, because they were wooden hulled rather than metal hulled, to try and trawl up these mines. So, that book, The Hidden Menace, it's a really disappointing book, but it's so, because Griffiths is a wonderful writer when he's writing Magic of the Swatchways and things, but The Hidden Menace is a very technical book. It's very interesting, but it's. I wish he could have written about mines the way he writes about swatchways, but maybe one can't. Maybe that's just silly. Of course, normally the main thing people think about lots of times when I haven't very often said what I'm doing, but when I have said what I'm doing, they say, "Oh, you mean the cruel sea?" I say, "Yep, I mean the cruel sea." But it has been, again, Montserrat. How was I going to feel about Montserrat? And I picked that picture of him rather than something more formal because I think it shows him as a complicated, slightly hunted, quite debonair, bit of a ladies' man, very interesting character. And he was one whose father had been away in the First World War, didn't get killed, but came back and really was intensely separate from his family. Just, there was a sort of wall, no emotional closeness. So it was a big thing when Montserrat's father sent him this Times advertisement saying, gentlemen interested in yachting. And Montserrat actually went and did it. And he was sure he was going to die. And so he started writing even when they weren't supposed to be writing. And the Navy and perhaps World War II propaganda in general was much more intelligent, I think, than it had been in other wars, because when they discovered Montserrat was writing about life on a corvette, they said, fine, we'll publish it. But of course, it's a very sanitized version of life on a corvette. But there it is, and it tells just how ghastly it is to be. So there's his HMS Campanula, a flower cast corvette. They were built in a great hurry at the very end of the 30s, and they weren't really meant to go out on the Atlantic, but there they went. They just rolled like pigs and terribly uncomfortable. And Montserrat hated his captain, but he pretends he doesn't in the cruel sea. But so in HMS Corvette, he wrote 3 little books during the war, and they sort of give an apparent insider's view, and that they're really not bad, particularly HM Corvette. Then, of course, after the war, in the 50s, there's that interesting 10-year gap which you get after the First World War as well, when people suddenly say, okay, fine, I can write about it now. You get a clutch of good books around 56, 57, about 10 years afterwards. And that's when he writes The Cruel Sea. And then you start to get a feeling for how intolerable it is being cooped up as an amateur sailor with a professional sailor who despises you and everything about you, and the whole the clash of amateur and professional. And then in the 1970s, he writes his autobiography, and he absolutely doesn't hold anything back at all. So you get 3 different views of the same period, which is jolly interesting. But I like to contrast him with Dennis Rayner, who of Robinetta, who you met earlier, who was a proper committed RNVR person, and he had command. He absolutely hassled. He was the first RNVR officer to get command of one of these, because normally they sent it to RNR officers, but Rayner was just so persistent. He was so determined. He's so funny. So he was the first RNVR officer to get command of a corvette, and later on he'd be the first to get command of a destroyer. And he loves his HMS Verbena, and he loves his crew, and you can see the difference in the sort of atmosphere. And so there's those 2, sister ships, completely different, little worlds of strife and unhappiness, or good fellowship and endurance. I was saying to Philip in the middle, I always love my friend Richard Woodman, who is a merchant Navy historian. And I love the title of that book, The Real Cruel Sea, when he points out that actually people who were really having a ghastly time, it wasn't actually Rayner and Montserrat on their corvettes. It was the people on the, the tankers and the freighters, laden with iron ore or whatever it might be. But anyway, so the Battle of the Atlantic, you could have a whole evening talking about the Battle of the Atlantic. And one of the very apposite comments I read in one history was that the problem was that the Navy didn't really think that at the beginning of the war that doing escort duty for convoys was actually, what a dashing young officer would want to do. So in fact, they were very quick to hand it over to the reservists to do that. And actually, that was probably a great pity, because later in the war, particularly when the Arctic convoys began, and the losses were becoming completely disproportionate, suddenly some of the real tactical naval brains got on the job, and things began to change. And of course, the fall of France had made everything so much worse, because then instead of the U-boats being based in Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, or the Norwegian ports, they were based in Lorient and La Rochelle and places, so they were straight out into the Atlantic. So, when Churchill said that was the one thing that really worried him, you can see why. At the beginning of the war, reservists were not allowed in submarines. Submarines were, too technical, too special. You were allowed to be, like my dad, you were allowed to be on HMS Forth, and you were allowed to, look after the submariners when they came back. And there's the wardroom at HMS Forth, where you're, giving them, because life on a submarine is pretty, smelly and grubby and claustrophobic and bally terrifying. So the least that the people on the depot ship can do is to, give you a nice polished table and some fine dining. And I can see that from my father's point of view, because he tried, I found letters where he writes, he says, I know I've got lousy eyesight, but actually I'm a very good cipher officer, and you do need cipher officers on submarines. And actually, if you're on a submarine, maybe your distance vision doesn't really matter too much if your job is to do, but he always got a, no, we don't need people like you. And to have these sort of heroes coming back, he writes somewhere that they dined, in his time in HMS Forth, they entertained 4 people, who won Victoria Crosses, and yet they were people of the same sort of age as him. It must make you feel a bit of a low life, mustn't it? When or just a bit sort of inferior. But there they're doing their best to give the submariners the R&R that they need. Now, here's one of my absolute heroes, and that's Edward Young. And I do commend his book. And I mean, this is just the sort of thing that makes you gasp, I think. He was the production manager at Penguin before the war. He was the chap who, he was the chap who put the icon on the penguins and, the orange banding and things. But he was a weekend sailor. And after Munich, he started doing one of these coastal courses. And he went off with his friends down the river to sort of practice at weekends. And, there he was in the RNV SR, and went off to King Alfred's. And he was there a little bit later. It was the beginning of 1941, and he heard a whisper that the Navy was actually thinking that they might possibly allow reservists to come into submarines if they've passed the astronavigation course. God knows why you had to do astronavigation to be, in a submarine. But and so Young was desperate to do this, and so he begged and pleaded, and they said, "Well, we've got 2 volunteers. We don't want any more." He said, "Oh, come on." So anyway, the others dropped out, and he did become the first RNVR person to be accepted on a submarine, and later he became the first amateur to command a submarine. You think about it, so in 1939, you're putting the P in Penguin. And by 1942, that's 2 years later, you're in charge of one of Her Majesty's submarines. I mean, it's just astonishing what people, brilliant people can do. The thing, apart from the Battle of the Atlantic, the other one, which John was mentioning earlier, that many people think of when they think of yachtsmen in the Second World War is coastal forces. It's MGBs and then TBs and motor launches. But the sad truth, and at the end of the First World War, that was what the young men of the RNVR were suddenly doing. In very late 1917 and early 1918, and Childers, again, was a little bit involved with it. There were these terrifying raids, the Ostend raid and the Zeebrugge raid, which did have quite a lot of completely untrained RNVR officers driving coastal motorboats. In the period between the war, the Navy completely forgot that it needed small ships. And again, this was one of Childers's main things. He called them mosquitoes with stings. He said, you've just got to think of the amount of damage that can be done. Sorry. The amount of damage that can be done by, the right sort of young chap with a fast boat and a couple of torpedoes. And at the end of the First World War, this had been grasped and understood. Between the wars, for some reason, the Admiral just didn't think they were going to want small boats anymore. And there's this, reading 1936, 37, 38 yachting monthlies, you'll see Hubert Scott Payne again and again saying, look at these wonderful speedy boats that I can build. And you'll see yachting monthlies say, yeah, and one's been bought by the Swedish government and 3 have been sent to Holland. And yet there was nothing from the Admiralty. So at the beginning of the Second World War, I think we had 12. 6 of them were down in the Mediterranean. No, that's right. And 6 were towed back through the French canals to here, and the other 6 went off to Singapore. And so that was 6. Whereas at the end of the First World War, we had 600. So it's just sort of astonishing. And people like Robert Hitchens, when they're so first he's on a minesweeper, and as the war moves into the summer of 1940, he gets increasingly wanting to do more. He's starting to see his friends being killed. He keeps applying to join coastal forces, and in the end, they accept him, and they accept another elderly solicitor, aged 40, called Alan Goatley, and they're the first reservists. And by this time, the Navy has woken up to the need for small, fast vessels, and they're being made by corporations like the Fairmile Corporation, almost sort of in kit form, so that any old boatyard, any old wardrobe maker virtually can make a motor gun boat. And so suddenly they are being churned out, and by 1941 they're really they're really being used. And of course, as the hostile shore, instead of being Germany, becomes Holland, suddenly being able to zoom across from Felixstowe, in the middle of the night, becomes realistic. So there are these in 1941, 42, particularly 43, there were these astonishing that they had Spitfire engines in these little boats. They were wooden boats, petrol, with these massive engines in them. And of course, they got hit, they went boom. I mean, just sort of terrifying. Whereas the E-boats had nice they were aluminium, and they had a nice round chine, and they were diesel. And Peter Scott, who was a very urbane, very, very charming, very diplomatic, he says, it's a pity the Admiralty didn't take more interest in diesel in the years between the war. At the end of, in 1944, 45, he has the good sense to get people to write their accounts in his book, The Battle of the Narrow Seas. Once you get the point of how quickly an MGB or an MTB can get across, you sometimes want to do it rather quietly. This chap, Dunstan Curtis, I had to put him by a Council of Europe thing, because after the war, he was really active in European affairs. But during the war, he was in charge of this MGB 314, and he was running, so when we were friends with Stalin, he had a job of running Soviet agents over to Brittany. And there's this, what did you say, John? You said he looks like Rupert Brooke, this charming young man, Francis Brooke Richards, and Jerry Holdsworth, who we met earlier, had a whole fleet of disguised fishing boats, sometimes with powerful engines, in Cornwall, so they could get across to Brittany and pick agents up or drop agents off, or rescue airmen who had escaped, had been shot down and escaped. Again, it's this man I love, David Howarth, and he was he started the war with the BBC, with Richard Dimbleby doing outside broadcast. He said, but there isn't any war, there's nothing to do. So by April 1914, he resigned from the BBC and went to join the RNVR. And eventually got his dream job. He was sent up to Shetland, because he spoke a bit of Norwegian, to liaise with the fishermen coming across from Norway to run this astonishing thing called the Shetland bus. And I realized that my time is going tick, tick, tick. So I will give you these people. This is Adrian Seligman. Many people will have read The Voyage of the Cap Pilar, I imagine. And he certainly fits the bill as the sort of think for yourself yachty. And one of his, he was the only person I think who actually got to use sailing skills during the war. He had a period when he was running this thing called the Levant Schooner Flotilla, when they were running people between the Greek islands. Very nasty, very complicated political stuff going on. And because we've been chucked out of Europe by then, we had to find ways of getting back. I'm sorry that I haven't talked more about the topographical unit, but the disaster at Dieppe, which my Uncle Jack was so angry about, really made people realize that if you're going to get back into Europe again, you're going to actually have to work out, what the beaches are like, what the gradient of the beaches are like, what the pebbles on the beaches are like. And Rory McLean, who was a very distinguished typographer, joined the pilotage parties, and his job was actually to go and check beaches in Sumatra in case we should want to go back there. But these people are checking channel beaches to get ourselves back into Europe. And here we are with a bit of a scuffle at the end. But I would like to just put it to you that the different contributions that people made. So there are some horrible rockets made by the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. There's the learning from Dieppe, the understanding of the importance of coastal navigation and coastal topography and pilotage. There's Patrick Dalzell Job, who has joined Ian Fleming's intelligence commandos, who had lots of, Quentin Riley was one of them, lots of the rather independent-minded RNVR types. And here, I hope there are people still here who remember Stuart and Beryl Platt. No, they were great CA members. Yeah, do you know Vicky? Vicky Platt, beautiful yacht. Yeah. Well, they're Vicky's parents, and Stuart was one of my father's dearest friends, and I always thought he was a bit sort of proper and sort of stodgy, and very, very nice, but respectable. And one day, my youngest brother was sailing with them on Celandine in France, and some sort of vandals looked as if they were about to threaten beautiful, beautiful Celandine. And Stuart suddenly picked up his boat hook and rushed Achtung, waving his boat hook. And my brother suddenly said, oh my God, that was a man who commanded a landing craft, age 20. And there's his landing craft. And so I think at that point, I must stop. I did have a last page, but we don't need it. I think we've gone from being out of Europe to being back in Europe. I think the sorts of skills of landing on coastlines, the sorts of initiative and thinking for yourself, have finally come good again. Whether we're subversive or not, I don't know. But anyway, thank you very much for letting me gallop through what has been a wonderful couple of years' work. Thank you very much.